Namaste and welcome to Nepal Conversations. In this podcast series, we will talk to scholars and researchers about their interesting work on various aspects of Nepali society. We ask them to reflect on old and new problems, challenges, and possibilities confronting Nepal. The theme for Nepal Conversations' first season is disasters. We will present a series of conversations on the topic of disasters and what it means for Nepali society. This series is supported by Levium Trust.
For this episode of Nepal Conversations, we are pleased to welcome Dr. Punam Yadav, who is a lecturer in Humanitarian Studies and co-director of the Institute of Risk and Disaster Reduction Center for Gender and Disaster at UCL. Prior to this, she was a research fellow in the Center for Women, Peace and Security and teaching fellow in the Department of Gender Studies at the London School of Economics and Political Science. She worked for over 10 years with various international and national NGOs before starting her academic career in 2010. She has a number of publications, including her academic monograph, Social Transformation in Post-conflict Nepal, A Gender Perspective, published by Routledge in 2016. Thank you, Poonam, for making yourself available to Nepal Conversation. So just to begin with, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your current research?
Hi, Nimesti and Umaji. Thank you so much for the invitation. I feel privileged to have this opportunity to share some of my work with you and with everybody who are listening to this podcast. So I'll just briefly say who I am. My name is Punam Yadav. I'm from Sira district of Nepal. I consider myself a practitioner academic as I worked with various NGOs in Nepal prior to starting my academic career. I'm interested in examining the gendered impacts of war on women, particularly transformative effects of war on women and marginalized groups. In recent years, my work is developing towards gender and disaster. I teach a postgraduate module called Gender, Disaster and Conflict, which brings conflict and disaster together and examines it through a gender lens. I'm also interested in, I'm also developing a new module on qualitative methods because I'm very keen on learning and teaching qualitative methods. So that's a brief introduction of myself. And currently I'm based at UCL at the Institute for Risk and Disaster Reduction. And I'm working there as a lecturer.
Yeah, thank you so much, Punamji. Much of your recent research has also focused on gendered dimension of disaster. Could you share why is it important to approach or study disasters from a gendered perspective, especially in the context of Nepal?
Disaster affects women, men, and sexual minorities differently due to socially constructed gender norms and unequal power relations. Gender inequality is further exacerbated in crisis situations. Exposure to disaster risk is facilitated by economic status, race, caste, ethnicity, age, religion, disability, and a number of other possible categories. Therefore, the same extreme event could have different impacts on different people due to their pre-existing unequal structures. So women and sexual minorities are often vulnerable and disproportionately affected by disasters due to gender inequality and social conditions that exposes them to various forms of violence, including sexual violence, child marriage, and trafficking. There has been increasing global attention to gender equality through, for example, the adoption of international policy frameworks such as Hugo Framework for Action 2005 and 15, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, and then likewise Sustainable Development Goals. The emphasis on gender-specific needs in these frameworks has created a degree of awareness among policymakers and implementers from the national to the local level in disaster contexts. However, has this kind of attention brought transformative changes to the lives of people impacted by these kind of disasters? especially when we consider women and sexual minority. That is still a question. Do the current gender-sensitive disaster risk reduction policies and practices have transformative effects? That's a question. To what extent has the integration of a gender perspective in DRR challenged the root causes of vulnerability and marginalization? That is still a question. So therefore, it is extremely important to understand any disaster context through a gender lens in order to understand the different impacts that a woman, man, or sexual minorities could have.
Okay, so just to follow up on that, one of your recent publications that came out in the International Journal of Disaster Risk Reduction, which is entitled A Feminist Vision for Transformative Change to Disaster Risk Reduction Policies and Practices. It's a really provocative title. What do you mean by feminist vision of disaster risk reduction policies and practices?
Thank you. That's a very good question. Actually, there is a lot of research done on gender in disaster context. A lot has been done for the past 2 decades. And as I said earlier, you can also see in every policy, gender is mentioned. Also in practices, you've seen and heard the practice of gender mainstreaming, even in disaster context. But if you look at the outcomes of those policies and practices, it hasn't made much difference. So therefore, in this paper, actually, we look at why this hasn't made much difference to the lives of people who are actually impacted by disaster, despite all of these policies and programs. They all talk about gender, but in fact, it has made no difference or very little difference to the lives of people. We wrote this paper trying to understand the problems, as well as then giving some more thoughts based on our own experiences, that how can we improve. And therefore we said, and our argument is that if you apply a feminist vision, then there is a possibility, or this brings a possibility for a transformative change that we all would like to see. What do we mean by that? What do we mean by feminist vision? In short, a feminist vision is about equality between people of all genders, caste, ethnicity, race, religion, reasons in Nepali context, and so forth. So feminism is not only about women, and likewise, the feminist vision is not only about or in favor of women, but it is inclusive of all human beings. It treats everybody equally, and also recognizes the differences and respects the different values and diversities. So if we approach DRR through a feminist vision, we are not looking at gender as socially constructed. Of course, gender is socially constructed, and therefore some people who identify as male are impacted differently by some people who are identified as female or sexual minorities. So obviously gender is socially constructed, but what we mean by feminist vision is that if you look at it, any disaster context through a feminist vision, you are able to identify the gendered impacts of those disasters due to socially constructed rules and norms and cultural practices. But also you're able to situate them in relation, so relational aspects as well of gender. So when we talk about gender, it is often understood as if it is only about women, but that is not true. If a woman is impacted in a family, the whole family is impacted. And if a woman is experiencing something, it is because of her relationship with somebody else. So it is very much relational. So even if you talk about, let's say, earthquake happened in Nepal, and then obviously men and women, all of them were impacted. Perception would be like, it's an earthquake, it's a natural disaster, so everybody is impacted equally, but that's not true. Certain gender are impacted more than the others. For instance, those who did not have the citizenship certificate, let's say, they were not able to go on and get the relief that the government was giving. and majority of them were women. So, so these women are not just on their own. They belong to a family, so their children will be impacted, and all of the other people who are associated with them are impacted. When we talk about, another example is when we talk about gender impact of disaster, sexual violence comes. Another is gender-based violence comes quite often in our discussion, likewise trafficking as well. So if a girl is trafficked, the whole family is impacted. Not just that, the whole process of trafficking due to a disaster, somehow it could be seen as inevitable because of the prior conditions that the person is living in. So if you look at it, if you look at disaster context through a feminist vision, you are able to see these kind of relational aspects, performative aspects of gender as well, and how these relational aspects and performative aspects of gender has impact on what people are going to experience. So therefore, we use that framing in our article to argue that the current DRR policies and frameworks, which are derived from a masculine vision, which is very much masculine vision, masculine way of seeing the world, does not actually serve the needs of the people. So we argue that the current DRR policies and frameworks, unless they put gender at the very start, at the very beginning of their thinking and policy making, it is not going to make any difference. It is just going to be something that will be added to the existing program, which will have very little chance of bringing about equality or making any difference to the lives of people.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you so much, Punamji, for that. Your previous research has also looked at the social and political impacts of Nepal's Maoist conflict on women. And we've been very inspired by your 2016 book titled Social Transformation in Post-conflict Nepal, A Gendered Perspective. How does your current research on gendered aspect of disaster compares with that on conflict? What are the commonalities or differences in these two fields of research?
Thank you, Mazi. That's a great question. So often when we talk about disaster, we think disaster is a consensus event. Everybody is equally impacted, and therefore there is some sort of a perception that everybody will support everybody. There is community cohesion and mutual aid. When we talk about conflict, we tend to think it's a political event, and the community is divided; they are not together, and therefore these two events need a different kind of support. In doing so, what we are doing, in fact, is that we are looking these two events in silos. So, for me, disaster is also conflict is also a form of disaster. So, in my definition of disaster, I also include conflict. So conflict is also a form of disaster. That's how I see it. So when I say that, I take disaster as a social process, not an outcome of a natural hazard led extreme event. It's a social process. It is something that is socially constructed. And that is what we've been talking about when we talk about gender in disaster. If disaster was something natural, so natural, it should have affected everybody equally, but that is not the case. So why are women impacted more than men in any disaster context? Because of their gender roles. For instance, if there is a flooding in Nepal, especially in rural villages, we are almost certain that there will be more women and children dying than men. And I quickly can think of two examples. One is, or reasons. One is often women are not, women don't know how to swim. So if the house is flooded or the village is flooded, obviously they do not have that skill. Second, because of the gender division of labor and the way the gender roles is understood, especially in rural villages where men are supposed to be the breadwinner of the family and women are supposed to be taking care of the households. So that means often men go out and these days, as you can see, lots of men migrate to Middle Eastern countries and other countries for work. So most of the villages are left with women and children. On the one hand, there are no men in the family. On the other hand, they don't have the skills, even as little as swimming skill we can think of. So obviously, the likelihood of women dying in flooding is much more than men. Likewise, because of their roles, they are confined within the household and they have less exposure to the outside world. So, for instance, earthquake happened and people had to displace, like in 2015, millions of people got displaced and some of them came to Kathmandu. And when they came to Kathmandu, if you look at the literacy rate among girls, in some places, the literacy rate is as low as less than 40% among girls. And we are talking about only the skills and ability to read and write. We are not talking about a decent education that can get them a job in the capital city in Kathmandu. So when they were displaced, what would they do? They have no exposure to outside world. They don't know how things work outside. They have no education, or at least a good education, so that that can give them or get them a decent job. So they end up working in places where neither they have the skills and nor they know how it works. So they are often exposed to violence. So therefore, that's one scenario. Let's again bring ourselves back into bringing these conflict and disaster together. So let's talk about Nepal context. So in Nepal, we disaster natural hazards related disaster is kind of a regular phenomenon. Everybody knows it, and we know every year there will be flooding during rainy season and landslides and fire. These are very common occurrence in Nepal. And we know that still, if you ask me whether we are prepared for it, that's a question mark. But we know that that happens, and also earthquake has been happening, and so that is going on. That's an ongoing thing. And if you add climate change to it, then there is a huge impact, and people have been impacted by various natural hazards related disaster events throughout the year, every year. But then we also had conflict for 10 years. And that further worsened people's situation in Nepal. And then soon after the peace agreement, there were various disaster events that impacted the similar group of people. And within 10 years, since the peace agreement, we had huge, this big earthquake that displaced around 3 million people, and 9,000 people were killed. And if you add all the secondary and tertiary impacts of that earthquake, it's a lot more. So, but then who were impacted? The same people, or almost the same people who were impacted by the civil war were impacted by the earthquake as well. But when you look at the intervention to support conflict victims and disaster victims by these natural hazard related disaster events, they are very different. There are two different organizations working to support people impacted by these two. Even if the same organization is working with both groups, they will have two different projects. If you look at the government institutions, they are looked at different events. So a disaster is dealt by another unit, conflict will be dealt by another unit. And to complicate this even more, it's been like 60 years since the Comprehensive Peace Agreement that was signed in 2006. But then there are still so many war-related grievances that hasn't been dealt with. And then we had earthquake, and there is every year. There are floodings and climate-related events and all that. All of these events have impact on people, and now this COVID pandemic, which we are so ill prepared for, absolutely no preparation whatsoever, despite all these comprehensive disaster-related policies and frameworks and practices. So therefore, I see these two events very much interlinked because same people are being impacted. So therefore, I do not want to differentiate between conflict and disaster. And that's what I do in my work as well. I bring these two events together and I look at it as one, or at least how one is influencing the other and how people are impacted by these events. So yeah.
That's really, really fascinating that you're trying. I think there's also a dearth of more general policy and academic literature and trying to bring these two things, like even conflict and disaster together. But given your experience in Nepal in both fields, as researchers, policymakers, or public officials, how much have we learned from the conflict and in our kind of way of thinking about or addressing other forms of disaster, like for example the 2015 earthquake? Did we learn to what extent do we learn from the conflict in terms of particularly in terms of its impact on like sort of gender dimension of disaster? What is the state of our collective understanding, in terms of formulating policies, programs from one disaster to another disaster? Do we follow up on those lessons in your experience, or is not much kind of lessons learned happening in this field?
Thank you. I think that's a very good question. And I wonder, have we learned anything? And from my experience and also what I have found out during my research, both that focused on conflict and disaster, that I think the learning is there, but then implementation, consideration is very less. As I mentioned earlier, that conflict is seen as a political event, and disaster is seen as something natural. That naturalness of disaster itself has a lot of consequences, especially for women. But if we don't want to go into that, let's not go into that debate. But then these two events, because these two events are seen different institutionally, so there is a different institution in place to look at natural hazards related extreme events and disaster events caused by natural hazards, and there is a different institution that looks at conflict. So conflict was seen as temporary, something that happened, came, people were impacted, affected the whole nation. There were extreme impacts of conflict, and it's gone now, it's over now. It is seen as if the conflict is over, and there is no tendency, I should say, or very little consideration to other forms of conflict. So in Nepal, it's very interesting how the international discourse influences our own understanding of certain events. So if we talk about conflict, only those conflicts are recognized as conflict that received international recognition. Other types of conflicts are not seen or even recognized, neither by the policymakers nor by any implementing bodies in Nepal. So conflict happened during 96 and 2006. After that, there were many ethnic conflicts, ethnic violence, and there are many still ongoing. Those are not considered. And that is problematic, because if you leave out all of these, which matters a lot to people, then you are leaving out on many things already, even without bringing the disaster into it, the natural hazard-led disasters. So basically, because of that, conflict happened 10 years, civil war, ended in 2006. Lots of money came Lots of organizations worked on disaster, post-conflict reconstruction and rebuilding and peace building, and you can call it what you like. There were different kinds of programs. Lots of money was spent on that. And then that went for about 10 years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission was then established, likewise Disappearance Commission. They have collected over 60,000 cases. However, all of these have now been overshadowed. Government doesn't want to talk about conflict. There are certain aspects of the impact government is still willing to consider, even though it hasn't gone that far, and that is the TRC and Disappearance Commission. That is a little bit there, but government does not think that there is any need for any peace building related activities or any other any kind of intervention to support any other victims of conflict. Government thinks that it has done enough. It's been over a decade, and we need to move on. So the conflict is like done and dusted. If I'm speaking on behalf of the government or the policymakers, there is no funding for any to deal with conflict-related grievances. If I'm speaking on behalf of the international NGOs or NGOs and UN agencies, but there is a funding for disaster, the natural hazards related disaster. And it has been there for a very, very long time. So there is a lot of funding, which I see non-political. So therefore, it is easy for the non-governmental organizations to work in Nepal on disaster than working on conflict and pushing the boundaries and getting into the political debate. And also because it is seen as a consensus event, it is seen as not caused by people, but caused by the nature, which you have no control over. So this sounds very uncontroversial. So disaster is seen as very much natural. Bhagwanle garda, it's because of the God. At once I heard somebody saying because women wore jeans and therefore we had earthquake. So that kind of misperception and misconception still is there in Nepal. What I'm trying to say is that it is much easier for people to work on disaster than conflict-related interventions in Nepal, especially now after like 15 years since the Comprehensive Peace Agreement. And there has been a lot poured into disaster risk reduction and management. So if you look at the policy, it's perfect. If you look at the DRRM policies and framework, it's really, really good. It has everything that you can think of. It has all of the incorporated everything that you can find in international frameworks. But then in practice, none of these is happening. Also, when these kind of policies, especially, let's talk about disaster risk reduction policies and frameworks and practices now. So if you have disaster risk reduction policies and practices, and if you are the organization who are working on it and devising policies or advising the government and coordinating with the government, you tend to think somehow that certain model that was quite worked well in other contexts will be applicable to Nepali context as well, such as if you look at the DRRM policy of Nepal and if you look at the Filipino DRRM policies, you'll find lots of similarities. Other thing that Nepali organizations and policymakers and implementers do not think about is the context. The context in Nepal is very dynamic. It is changing. It has changed so much since the new DRRM policy was adopted in 2017. So in that policy, it has no vision for the federal structure, and therefore it hasn't derived the structures for it. And all of a sudden, the governance had changed, and therefore there is a lot of confusion. Who is going to do what? What is going to be the role of the federal government? What kind of disaster events will be considered as bigger events, larger events that can be then supported by the federal government? what kind of disaster events should be supported by the provincial government, and likewise, what kind of disaster events should be seen as small-scale events that could be supported by the local government. So there is a lot of confusion about the roles of different government in Nepal at the moment, and likewise, the same confusion is also, you can find also with those supporting like non-governmental organizations. So there was a cluster system before, 11 cluster. Now, what is the role of the cluster? Before we had CDO, now it is going ahead as well, but what is the role of CDO now, since you have now 3 levels of government? How are they going to work with the local governments? There is a confusion about that too. So there is a lot of confusion about who is going to do what. And so I think the disaster context, or any context, should be seen as dynamic, and there has to be some sort of flexibility in order to adapt to the changing context, and that doesn't seem to be the case in Nepal.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting, because when you bring in the tension in the formulation, particularly as you said, the problem with the implementation of these policies, and obviously you also raised very important point about the involvement of international actors. And I wanted to ask a little bit further on what do you see is the involvement of international aid community, because you've also written extensively, done recent research about it. The involvement of international aid community in promoting what you were mentioning about more, their lack of understanding or of context. Could you talk a little bit about their involvement in promoting and implementing such policies, or what could such policies look like, in terms of the involvement of the international community?
I mean, the international community could do a lot for Nepal if they really wish to do so. And they have done to some extent. Like, there is a lot of awareness about various forms of disasters in Nepal. So lots of awareness raising program. There are lots of small scale support and interventions at various levels. But the problem with the international intervention is that often they are small scale and very much like projectized approach. So you have a project that is there for a year or 2 year or 3 years project, and once the project is finished, you are gone from there and you have no liability or responsibility. So the more I think about Nepali context, the more I feel like the international communities who are working like a parallel government at the moment in Nepal, especially when you talk about international development interventions and disaster risk reduction, instead of operating as a parallel government and trying to support people parallelly to the government, but at the same time not have the capacity to actually support everybody and be very selective, select one community out of hundreds and then implement your program, I do not think that's the right approach. If it was, then it would have already made a difference, because we have international community present in Nepal for a very, very long time. So only way out that I can see is that working with the government has a very good systems and the mechanisms in place from the central to the very local level. So working with the government, building government's capacity, and channeling all of the program through one door. So one door policy is that I think it will work. How it is going to work, what are the problems, what are the challenges, that needs to be discussed and decided. There are some challenges, obviously lots of challenges, but that is where the focus should be. How can we mitigate these challenges and work as one instead of operating it as parallel government? And government is doing one thing and the international NGO is doing the other thing, and that is one of the reasons why it hasn't worked and hasn't been effective. So I would really emphasize 2 things. One is avoiding the silos. Silo is not only between the issues like conflict and disaster, natural hazards related disaster events seen differently, and you can, to complicate that, add climate change. Climate change is seen very different and dealt by different people, even though the impact of climate change is experienced in the form of various forms of disaster. but they don't work together. So not just issue-based, removing issue-based silos, but also removing the silos between the government and non-governmental organizations, and also better coordination between the non-governmental organizations. If we can do that, then I think it is going to be more effective. The second is that working as one again and channeling all the funding through one governance structure, and all of them working together. That might give a better result than doing small bits here and small bits there. That is not going to bring any transformative impact.
Yeah, thank you so much, Punamji. We are now coming to the end of our conversation, but before we go, we'd like to ask a question on your experience of research collaborations. You've been working together with researchers in Nepal, here in the UK, and in other parts of the world as well. What has been your experience of building and implementing such cross-country collaborative research in studying disasters? What do you think are opportunities and challenges?
I think there is a lot of opportunity actually. So I mean, there are lots of now collaborative projects in Nepal, and I've seen also other people collaborating with the scholars in Nepal. There is a really growing academic community who are very strong, very articulate, and really good thinkers. So there is a lot already going on, and I see there is a lot of opportunity for collaboration through very much academic research focused organizations, to also various universities. There are new universities also coming up now, which will have more emphasis on research-led teaching. So, I mean, my own experience of collaborating in Nepal has been very good, and I also see a lot of opportunity for collaboration in Nepal. Challenges, I mean, as anywhere, you might face challenges in Nepal as well, but I do not see a huge challenge for collaboration with Nepali scholars. They're very open for any kinds of collaborative work. Maybe one suggestion maybe that might be beneficial for newcomers in academia who have no contacts or very little contacts in Nepal. So maybe having some sort of a collection of expertise, like a database, where you see who are the academics or researchers working in Nepal, and what are their contacts, what are their interests. And then if we have that somewhere, then those who are new to Nepal but then would like to work with the Nepali scholars or in Nepal, it will be easy for them to identify who they should go to for what kind of purpose and what kind of work. So I think having that database might help. That's the only thing I can think of at the moment.
Thank you so much, Punamji, for that. It's really interesting, fascinating. Thanks so
Absolutely.
much for sharing your insights.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.